Hello again, everyone. I'm Dennis. Welcome back to the bindery. We've got a lot to do today, so let's jump right into it. At the end of the last video, I said I had something extra in mind for the cover of this book. What I have in mind is called an envelope flap. It's an extension of the back cover that folds up over the foredge and then out over the front of the book. The envelope flap was a common feature of historic Islamic bindings, so I think it'll make for a fitting element for this copy of Dune. Rather than the traditional shape, though, I've decided to go with this asymmetrical triangular design, which I think gives a bit more of a sci-fi feel. To make the flap, I'll use two thicknesses of bookboard. One is the same 2.5mm I used for the covers, and the other is half that, about 1.25mm. I'm using the thinner board because I want to make a circular recess in the front flap. I'll use this cutting circle tool. It has a rotary razor blade, and by setting the distance carefully, I can make an accurate circle. At least, that's the plan. This thing was made for thin materials, so it takes a while. And I still have to flip the board over to finish the cut from the other side. The end result is a bit ragged, but I can work with that. By cutting through one layer of board and then laminating it to a second piece, I can be sure that the recess is a consistent depth. I'm using PVA for this task, both for speed and to minimize any warping from excess moisture. I'll let Mr. Ritchie put the squeeze on that while I work on the foredge piece. This is just a rectangle of the 2.5mm board, cut to the same height as the covers of the book, but a little narrower than the thickness of the text block. The loose fit now is to give room for the leather hinges that I'll be making later. After about 10 minutes in the press, the front flap is ready to work with. I'll use my scale drawing to lay out the dimensions before cutting it down to size. And then I do a final check against the book itself. Adding moving parts like this to a full leather binding is a new challenge for me, and as you can imagine, getting the fit up just right is a must. So to keep things from getting out of alignment, I want to lock these pieces in place now. To do that, I'm going to turn once again to my Kozo paper. I'm using PVA here for speed. My thinking is that if I can glue the flap pieces in place now, I'll be able to make sure that I have the right spacing, rather than fooling around with these bits while I'm awash in acres of wet leather and paste. I glue at the foredge flap and then move right away to trimming the Kozo to size. I say trimming, but I'm actually using water to help tear the paper in a straight line. The feathered edge will help the paper blend in, even though it'll be under the leather. I made up a couple of spacers to align the flap pieces, and as you can see, the spacing of the parts isn't equal. I can then glue on the cover flap, using the wider spacer to create the hinge. If you look carefully, you can see I'm using a ruler along the bottom edge to keep the two pieces aligned. I'll use the narrower spacer and the same ruler trick to glue the flap assembly to the back cover of the book. And because the book is now this weird shape, I'm using a brick rather than the press to hold everything in place while the glue dries. There'll be a lot of that in this video. After an hour or so, I can remove the bricks, and you can see that the flap is now essentially functional. The fit is a bit loose right now, but that's by design. What a cover flap like this needs is some way of keeping it closed, and the solution I'm going with is to use magnets. Having an invisible force incorporated into what appears to be an ancient object is just the sort of Dune vibe I'm going for. I don't have access to sci-fi technology like suspensors or tractor beams, so magnets will have to do. I begin by marking where the edge of the flap will rest on the cover. I'll use 3 magnets where the flap is widest. Hopefully those will be strong enough to hold the flap closed, but not so strong that you'll need a crowbar to open it. I space the magnets back from the edge of the flap a bit, then trace out their positions onto the cover. This punch is what I'll be using to make the recesses the magnets will fit into. Originally, I thought a hammer would be needed for this task, so I put a tin inside the book for protection, but in the end I found twisting the tool did a better job. After making the initial cut, I can pop out a layer of paper. I found that doing this twice gave me just the right depth for the magnets to sit flush with the top of the board. If you're wondering, these magnets are 1 millimeter thick and 10 millimeters in diameter. To fix the magnets in place, it's washi to the rescue once again. Using some water, I tear out 3 rough circles of kozo, about twice the diameter of the magnets. I glue out one of my circles and lift it with a pair of tweezers. And right about here is where I remembered that my tweezers are steel and I'm working with magnets. No problem though, non-magnetic fingers get the job done just as well. With that lesson learned, it's no problem to apply the other 2 paper retainers, and I add a bit more glue onto the outside for good measure. Then, it's time for another brick to let things dry. Those are dry now, but I'm not going to add the corresponding magnets into the flap until later. Instead, I'm going to cut a small groove in the back cover. This recess will be where I incorporate an integral leather bookmark later. It'll be attached under the leather, so I need to prepare for that now. Much like with the recesses for the magnets, I cut around the outline, then pry out the board material. The fact that bookboard comes apart in layers like this makes it a relatively easy task. I do that a couple of times until I've achieved the correct depth. It's time to get started on the leather covering, and seeing as I've got this flap to work with, I'm going to need quite a large piece. To make my life easier, I'm going to make a cutting template. I'll lay the book out on a large piece of cardstock. I open the flap and make sure I've got enough space on the right-hand side. Then I'll close the book and use a rolling motion to flip it over, keeping contact with the paper as I do so. I'll then mark the corners of the front cover, as well as the hinge locations for both the front and the back of the book. I'll then finish marking out around the cover flap. Connecting up all of those marks will give me a precise template for the book, with the 3 main areas being the front cover, the spine, and the back cover / flap all defined. Next I'll cut out the template, leaving a wide margin around the outside to allow enough material for the turn ends. My ruler makes for a convenient 1-inch spacer for this. I'll also cut out the middle portions, which, much like my little viewing window template from part 2, will allow me to choose just the part I want from the leather. Speaking of which, as you can see, I've had this sample of sandworm hide sent in special from Arrakis. Not fooled? Okay, this is actually goat skin, but it has this bold, mottled texture that looks like it came from a hostile environment, so I think it's perfect. Once I've used my template to select the portion I want, I use some weights to hold it in place while I cut it out using a long ruler and a fresh, sharp blade. Luckily, I didn't make the mistake of reversing the template, which would have put the flap portion on the wrong side. I do a quick test fit to see that I've got the sizing right, but I can't help but have a peek at it and get an idea of how it's going to look. My template has one more use, and that's to mark the perimeter of the book onto the inside of the leather. I'm just using a Sharpie for this, as it won't show through the other side. These marks will help both with pairing the leather in the next step, and for aligning it onto the book when I paste it out later. To pair the leather, I'm using my modified spoke shave. Pairing the edges of the leather is meant to reduce the thickness of the turn-ins, which are the bits of leather that wrap around to the inside of the covers. I'm not pairing all the way back to the lines though, as I'm aiming for a more chunky brutalist look anyway. This is more to reduce the thickness of the transitions from the leather to the end papers on the inside. With this much leather to paste out, things are going to get messy, so I'm going to wrap the text block to keep it clean throughout the process. This is called a cap in bookbinding terms, and it's nothing special, just some regular paper that I trim out roughly to size with scissors. The triangular flaps fold against the head and tail, Then the sides get folded up and held in place with a bit of tape. I'll also cut a couple of curved pieces, which I attach to the head and tail to help guard right up to the end bands. One last thing before I start pasting is to trim the leather a bit where it'll be turned in at the head and tail. Sometimes I pare this very thin, but in this case the extra thickness will be a feature on the spine. Because this piece of leather is so large and awkwardly shaped, I'm going to approach attaching it in stages. I'm going to start with the spine of the book, as that will align the material on both the front and back covers. I begin by dampening the hair side of the leather with plain water. The leather needs to be damp in order to be soft enough to mold around the bands on the spine. I'll add paste to the flesh side, just along the spine area and well in from the head and tail. Then I'll fold it over to let that soak in for a while. This is the same wheat starch paste I used in the repair portions of part 1, and by the time I did this it was a couple of weeks old. It still worked well enough, though the texture had become a bit granular. After a few minutes I scrape off the excess paste, then reapply. I do this twice to ensure the leather is well saturated with paste, and I keep it moist with water on the outside. I also add paste to the book itself in the corresponding areas. With a final fresh layer of paste on the leather, it's time to bring these two together. I carefully align the spine of the book with the layout marks I made earlier. Then, when I've got it positioned, I can flip the whole thing over to start molding the leather. Working with just my hands at first, I gently push the leather down over the bands. It'll gradually start to conform to the contours, which is when I switch to using my bone folder to add more precise pressure. As the leather relaxes and the paste starts to grab, the bands become more and more defined. When I've done all I can with the folder, I put the book into the press and switch to a specialized tool called a band nipper. It's basically a pair of pliers with smooth, wide jaws that are designed specifically for this purpose. I'm not pinching the bands, but rather holding the jaws at a fixed width while I glide them over the leather. With the bands well defined, I want them to stay that way, so I'm going to tie the book up with some stout cotton cord. I make sure to keep good tension on all the wrappings, and then I tie off the cord with a clove hitch and a couple of half hitches. I'll then set the whole thing aside to dry until tomorrow. In the meantime, I can get started on making my bookmark. For this I'll be using a different leather. This is calfskin, about 1 millimeter thick. I'm going to be making a flat 5-strand braid for this, for which I'll need 5 thongs that are all attached at one end. Now, anyone who has cut leather with a knife and straight edge will know that the material can readily stretch or twist during the cut. I need the thong cuts to be very straight and parallel, so I came up with this trick to get it done. I first attached some painter's tape to the flesh side of the leather, and then with the hair side up, I use another piece of tape to fix it to my cutting mat. I then cut a strip 5/8 of an inch wide, and more tape gets added first to the underside of the strip, and then another to hold everything in place. This effectively sticks the leather to my mat, preventing any movement. I can then lay out my 5 thongs with some calipers and cut them, leaving one portion at the end uncut to hold them all together. And when I'm done, I simply pull the thongs off the tape. To make the braid, I first moisten the leather with water. I found this helps the leather take the bends of the braid without curling up. This is going to be a bookmark after all, so I want it to be reasonably flat. Another bit of tape holds the thong to a handy brick, which gives me a bit of clearance to begin the weave. I start with the 3 inner thongs to establish the braid, and after that it's a simple right over left, left over right pattern. Once the braid is long enough, I taper the ends of each of the thongs, and then secure them with a simple overhand knot. I could have researched some sort of fancy ball knot for this, I suppose, but I think this works with the contrasting crude/refined aesthetic that I've got going with this book. The last thing I'll do to this braid will be to flatten it some more. I wet it down well, and then I'll put it in the press between a couple of tins, applying as much pressure as I can. It's still a bit damp when I take it out later, but as you can see, it's now reasonably flat. It's the following day and the spine should be fully dry, so it's time to continue with stage 2 of attaching the leather. I'm working my way up by surface area, so that means the front cover is next. The process is the same as before. I dampen the outside of the leather with water. Here I'm using my cutting mat as a convenient moisture barrier. I then apply a liberal amount of paste to the inside. This is a new batch of wheat flour paste which I made myself. I'll put the recipe for it in the video description. As before, I let the paste soak in for a while. Then scrape away the excess, apply more paste, and repeat. I also paste out the coverboard and the hinge area before laying down the leather. And now's a good time to talk about why I use paste for leather. As you'll see, this is a slow process which often requires repositioning the material in order to get it shaped and molded around all the contours of the book. Paste has a very long working time, and is very forgiving of such fiddling about, but without compromising on its strength when dry. So as far as I'm concerned, for this particular task, paste is the ideal adhesive. For the outer corners I need to trim the leather back, so to do this I fold it back onto some scrap card and make a beveled cut with my paring knife. The impression of the coverboard in the damp leather acts as a guide, which helps me judge where to make the cut. With those trimmed, I can then do the turn-ins, adding extra paste as necessary. Oh, and if you can hear a knocking sound in the background, don't mind that, it's just my new neighbors. They moved in when the weather got warm. Hopefully they won't stay long. Where the turn-ins meet at the corners, I'll pleat the thinned leather together. If necessary, I trim out any excess material before smoothing everything into place. I find a few taps with the hammer helps to convince the leather to stay put. To finish, I add a blotter and some parchment paper, then close the book. A knitting needle will serve to establish the groove, and then I place it under some weight to dry. Towards the end of the day, the cover's set up enough for me to carry on working. As you can see, the book opens well, and the turn-ins are firmly attached. Now I just need to tackle the significantly larger surface area of the back cover and flap assembly. By now I think you know the routine, though there are a few extra elements here that I need to be careful of. The first is these turn-ins at the head and tail. I need to soften them with water so I can open them up and ease them around the back cover. Lots of paste gets applied and applied again, including to the entirety of the front flap. The whole thing is rather unwieldy, and I have to put a lot of thought into just how to move the thing around. I will say I'm glad that I made the washy hinges for the flap. Trying to assemble all those pieces and keep them straight at this stage would be a beast. At the hinges of the flap, I take some time to work the leather well down into the joints. Then, on the outer side, I firm down the joint as well as the recess on the front flap. Trimming the leather on the flap corners was a bit of a puzzle. Unlike the 45-degree bevels on standard corners, these strange angles required a different approach. The top corner needed a sort of concave cut, while the sharp bottom corner needed to be trimmed to a sort of blunt point. To attach the leather bookmark, I first established the location by pressing the leather down into the recess. I then carefully make an incision in the leather with a fresh sharp blade. No room for error here. Once established, I use my micro spatula to ease the bookmark into the gap and press it into place. I give the entire cover a final once-over to make sure that everything is looking good, and then I'll add my knitting needle into the groove. I also put the offcut from the circular recess into place to add some pressure there. After that, yeah, you guessed it, I add some weight and I let the whole thing dry overnight. Good morning. Let's unburden this poor book and see where we're at. Everything's dry and it's looking pretty good, but I detected a slight problem. Either I mismeasured or the leather shrunk because the flap won't stay closed properly. I'll have to think about how to deal with that. Also, I've known this for a while, but I didn't make the leather hinge of the end papers quite wide enough. It reaches the boards, but just barely. That'll need sorting out as well. But first, let's deal with that flap issue. My thinking is that, much like a new pair of shoes, this cover could use some breaking in. To do that, I'll first dampen the leather along the flap hinges, both on the outside and the inside. I'll then add in two spacers between the front cover and the flap. I'll gently but firmly ease that down, and then I'll add a bit of extra water for good measure. Then, I'll turn once again to my good friends, gravity and time, to sort things out. Well, another day has gone by, but it seems to have been worth it. As you can see, the cover flap now functions perfectly. Time now to fix those hinges. I'll begin by pasting them in place. I'm not bothering with the multi-step paste, remove, repeat here. Just one layer of paste will do. I mold them around the hinge and the edge of the board, then close them up inside the book with some blotters and release paper. While those set up, I can work on the inner flap hinges. These will be lined with more thin leather. I made up these strips just as I did for the end papers in part 2, trimming them very thin using my skiving device. I then beveled the edges to 0 thickness, marked and trimmed them for length, and pre-mitered the corners to hopefully give a more finished appearance. Oh, and I beveled those miters too. As with the rest of the leather, these get attached with paste and molded into place. To hold them there, I cut some strips of board to width, and these I lined with packing tape to keep them from sticking to the leather. When that round of paste is dry, I can turn back to the hinges. Using a ruler and blade, I carefully trim the hinge leather just below the level of the board and peel away the excess. I then paste in some more thin strips of leather that I prepared, overlapping the hinge leather along the edge of the board. By positioning the seam between the two pieces in the inside corner, it becomes practically invisible. I can then position the book in yet another awkward position, add bricks, and let it dry. Well, that was a process, but the leather is finally all on the book. If you're still here, thank you for sticking with me. Hopefully it won't distress you to hear that I now have to take some leather back off the book, in a controlled way of course, and for a good reason. As you can see, my turn-ins are all different widths. To clean things up, I'm going to trim them back equal to the narrowest part, which is right here. I set my calipers to this distance, then transfer that measurement all around the inside of the covers. Using my straight edge and a sharp blade, I very carefully cut back the turn-ins. I can then peel away the excess leather, and as you can see, the paste is holding strong as it's pulling away some of the bookboard underneath. I do this to the inside of both covers and to the flap as well. To bring the inside of the covers up flush with the leather, I'm going to infill with some cardstock. I mark out the pieces and cut them to size. This card is about 1/2 mil in thickness and doesn't really stretch at all when it's wet, so it shouldn't warp the covers. I'll then glue them in with straight PVA, which will grab quickly without adding a lot of moisture. I still need to, yes, I know, that's right, weigh everything down and let it dry. Well, I'm happy to tell you that the covering is now complete, but there's one more thing I need to work on. Those magnets are still sitting there under the leather, serving no purpose at all until I give them something to grab onto. That, of course, will be more magnets. I'll use the magnets themselves to ensure I get them in the right position. With them stuck to their companions inside the cover, I'll use some double-sided tape to transfer their positions to the inside of the front flap. I can then easily mark out where they've stuck, and I'll be sure that they'll be aligned perfectly with the magnets in the front cover. It's then simply a matter of cutting out the recesses and embedding the magnets with washi paper as I did before. In this case, though, the magnets are quite close to the leather turn-ins, in fact underneath in one spot, so I trimmed the washi patches appropriately. You know, it's one thing to sketch a design on paper, quite another to see it realized as a real thing that you can hold in your hands. It's been a long road to get here, so thank you so much for your patience if you've been following along with this series, and thank you for watching until the end here. If you enjoyed the video, then clicking the like button is the easiest way to say thanks. I really do appreciate it. If you'd rather support me directly, you can do that too. Just follow the link in the description to buy me a coffee. Cheers! I'll be back with one more installment in this series to see this project completed, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it. That's all for this one though, so until next time, I'm Dennis, and I'll see you in the next video.